Welcome to Midnight Archives, where the strange, the unsolved, and the downright eerie come to light. Every week, we dive deep into the mysteries history tried to bury. Buckle up, it's about to get weird. Thank you for watching. In the early morning haze of July 2, 1937, a Lockheed Electra 10E lifted off from Lae Airfield in Papua New Guinea. On board were two souls, the world-renowned aviator Amelia Earhart, and her navigator, Fred Noonan. Their destination, a tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean called Howland Island, just over 2,500 miles away. Their mission, to complete the most daring flight of their lives, a circumnavigational journey around the globe at the equator. They never arrived. Amelia Earhart was no ordinary pilot. She was a cultural icon, a trailblazer for women in aviation, a media darling, and a symbol of fearlessness in an era still learning to accept women who chase danger. With her tousled hair, leather jacket, and confident stare, she captivated the world with each record-breaking flight. But this final voyage, this ambitious around-the-world attempt, would be her most perilous yet. At the time, aviation was still in its adolescence. There were no GPS systems, satellite phones, or real-time tracking. Everything relied on compasses, maps, and dead reckoning, a combination of time, direction, and estimation. That made Howland Island a particularly cruel destination. Just 2.5 miles long and half a mile wide, it was nearly invisible from the sky, like trying to land on a sand grain in the middle of the sea. What we do know comes from logs, radio transcripts, and the voices of those who tried to help. Earhart and Noonan had successfully completed 22,000 miles of their journey. The Lae to Howland leg was to be the final ocean crossing. After that, a relatively simple flight to Hawaii, and then California, home. But as they approached the final stretch, radio contact grew erratic. At 7:42 a.m., a message crackled over the airwaves: "We must be on you, but cannot see you, but gas is running low." A final transmission came minutes later: "We are running north and south." Then, silence. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed near Howland Island, never made visual contact. They'd been attempting to guide the plane in via radio, sending signals and waiting for confirmation, but Earhart's plane never responded with coordinates. The search began almost immediately. Battleships and planes combed the Pacific for days. President Roosevelt authorized what was, at the time, the most expensive air and sea search in U.S. history. Nothing. Not a shred of wreckage. Not a trace of fuel. Not even a floating scrap of aluminum. Amelia Earhart vanished. In the weeks following Amelia Earhart's disappearance, the world waited, not for answers, but for a miracle. They clung to hope. Newspapers printed daily updates, often speculative, occasionally fictional. One headline would claim they'd been spotted. Another would say they were captured. And yet, as the search dragged on, hope slowly turned into a haunting absence. The official explanation was brutal in its simplicity: they ran out of fuel, missed Howland Island, and crashed somewhere into the Pacific, never to be seen again. A tragic but plausible theory. After all, that stretch of ocean was vast, unrelenting, and merciless. One wrong heading, one navigational error, and the Electra could disappear forever beneath the waves. But something about that explanation never satisfied the public. Not because it wasn't possible, but because it left too many threads dangling. Too many unanswered questions. Why hadn't a single piece of the plane surfaced? Why were radio signals received after the supposed crash? And most chilling, why did those signals seem to come from land, not sea? In the days after their last transmission, amateur radio operators across the Pacific began reporting strange messages, faint, static-filled, and unmistakably desperate. Some claimed to hear Amelia's voice. Others recorded phrases like "down on a reef" or "injured, but alive." One 15-year-old girl in Florida swore she heard a woman's voice pleading for help: "This is Amelia Earhart. Help me. We are on a small island." Many of these transmissions were dismissed as hoaxes or wishful thinking. But some were credible enough that they led to a second round of searching, this time directed toward the Phoenix Islands, specifically Nikumaroro, then known as Gardner Island. Nikumaroro was uninhabited, desolate, and difficult to reach. But there was one strange coincidence. 3 days after Amelia's last message, a U.S. Navy plane scouting the island saw signs of recent activity, what looked like disturbed vegetation and possible signs of life. However, the crew dismissed it, believing no one could have possibly been there. They didn't land. They didn't search. Decades later, that oversight would ignite a completely new theory. It was the 1980s when the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIRE, took interest in Nikumaroro. They were intrigued by several factors: the old radio reports, the naval sighting, and, most of all, the island's geography. Its flat coral reef made for a potential emergency landing strip, at least at low tide. Could Amelia have landed there, surviving the crash only to succumb to the island itself? In 1940, British colonial officers had discovered a partial human skeleton on Nikumaroro, along with a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and a bottle of freckle cream. The remains were initially examined and dismissed as male. But decades later, modern forensic review of the original measurements suggested the bones likely belonged to a tall Caucasian female. There was just one problem: the bones had long since been lost. Still, TIRE kept digging. Over the years, their expeditions recovered pieces of aluminum that could have belonged to a Lockheed Electra, improvised tools, remnants of a campfire, and fragments of what looked like a compact mirror. A 1930s-era woman's compact mirror. One of the most tantalizing discoveries was a small glass jar, broken, weathered, and half buried. After analysis, it was identified as the kind used to store Dr. Barry's freckle ointment, a product marketed specifically to women in the 1930s, and known to be used by Amelia herself. Suddenly, the narrative began to shift. The crash and sink theory started to seem less certain. What if they had survived? What if the Pacific hadn't swallowed them whole, but stranded them instead? TIRE's hypothesis became this: Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan landed on the reef at Nikumaroro. They survived for days, maybe weeks, broadcasting distress signals when the tide was low and the Electra's battery was dry enough to function. Then the tides claimed the plane, and the two were left to face the harsh island alone, eventually dying as castaways. No rescue ever came. As more eyes turned to the tiny coral speck of Nikumaroro, others turned their attention to something more sinister. The story of a tragic crash and slow death on an island was already heartbreaking, but what if it wasn't the whole story? What if Amelia Earhart didn't just disappear? What if she was taken? This theory, often called the Japanese capture hypothesis, posits that Amelia and Fred didn't crash near Howland Island, nor land on Nikumaroro. Instead, they veered thousands of miles off course, perhaps due to navigation error or mechanical failure, and landed in the Marshall Islands, which were under Japanese control at the time. According to this theory, they were captured by the Japanese military under suspicion of espionage. Some versions say they were interrogated and later executed. Others suggest they lived out their lives in secrecy, perhaps even under false identities. It sounds far-fetched, until you start looking at the scattered evidence. In 1937, tensions were high in the Pacific. Japan had occupied the Marshall Islands for years, and war was brewing. The United States, already wary of Japan's expansion, had been conducting covert surveillance in the Pacific, using planes and ships disguised as civilians. Amelia, with her high-profile flight plan and new, advanced radio equipment, would have been the perfect cover for reconnaissance. This theory grew legs when eyewitnesses from the Marshall Islands and Saipan began to surface, locals who claimed to have seen a white woman and tall man being held by Japanese soldiers. One witness said he helped move a plane matching the Electra's description. Another claimed to have seen the woman, later shown a photo of Amelia, imprisoned and then executed. In 2017, a photograph surfaced from the U.S. National Archives showing a woman and man on a dock in the Marshall Islands. Some believed the figures matched Amelia and Fred. The man resembled Noonan, tall, with a receding hairline. The woman had short hair and a frame similar to Earhart's. And sitting in the background? A ship believed to be the Koshu Maru, known to have operated in the area. However, within weeks, the photo was debunked. It was found in a Japanese travel book published in 1935, 2 years before Amelia's flight. The theory wasn't killed, but it was dealt a heavy blow. Still, the capture theory remains one of the most emotionally charged. If true, it means Amelia didn't just vanish, she was left behind by her own government. It would turn her disappearance from tragedy to betrayal. And yet, there's no concrete proof. No documents. No plane. No bodies. Just stories. Others have offered even stranger explanations. A theory emerged in the 1970s claiming Amelia survived, but under a new identity. A woman named Irene Bolam, a New Jersey banker, was accused in a book of actually being Earhart living incognito. Bolam sued for defamation, denying everything, and the book was pulled from circulation. Later facial analysis suggested the two women weren't the same person. Still, the idea lingered. Could she have come home, changed her name, and vanished into normal life? Not likely. Not for a woman who spent her life chasing the edge of the map. By the early 2000s, most serious researchers had returned to the two prevailing theories, crash and sink, or Niku Maroro. And still, both carried holes. Crash and sink theorists point to the lack of hard physical evidence from the island, no definitive proof of the Electra, no bodies, no confirmed artifacts. But that theory, too, struggles. Decades of sonar scanning in the waters around Howland have failed to turn up any signs of the wreckage. Meanwhile, Niku Maroro keeps offering slivers of possibility. In 2020, a high-tech expedition led by Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, explored the island and surrounding reefs using deep-sea robots. The team found nothing definitive, but Ballard admitted it was one of the most challenging sites he'd ever worked on. The terrain was brutal, the tides unpredictable, the clues maddeningly subtle. In the end, no expedition, to land or sea, has ever closed the book. What's most remarkable, though, isn't how Amelia Earhart disappeared. It's how deeply she stayed in the public consciousness. In a world filled with short-lived headlines and quickly forgotten tragedies, Earhart became something mythic, a symbol of ambition, bravery, and the unknown. She was a woman who challenged everything: gender roles, flight records, the limits of technology and human will. Her voice, crackling over the radio on that final flight, became the whisper of an entire generation staring into the dark. Even now, schools are named after her. Statues stand in her honor. Children still do book reports and science projects about her. She's been played in films, written into novels, and speculated on in countless documentaries. The world never really let her go. Maybe because we need people like Amelia Earhart, those who don't just talk about pushing boundaries, but take the controls and fly toward them. And maybe because a story without an ending keeps hope alive. Hope that one day, someone will find the last missing piece, a wing in the sand, a name carved into coral, a journal sealed in a waterproof bag, and finally, tell us what happened that morning over the Pacific. But until then, Amelia remains where she always has, just out of reach, in the thin air between truth and legend. The Pacific Ocean has never given up its secrets easily. As the decades passed, the trail of Amelia Earhart's disappearance grew colder, not from lack of interest, but from time's slow erosion of evidence. The coral reefs changed shape. The sands shifted. Survivors passed away. But the mystery refused to fade. Instead, it took on a life of its own. Amelia's name didn't simply live in the headlines, it became a cultural landmark. She wasn't just an aviator anymore. She was a folk hero. A mystery. A symbol. Her face appeared on postage stamps and murals. Schools and scholarships were named after her. Her likeness was etched in stone and steel. And for generations of women, and men, she became proof that courage didn't have to wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wore a leather flight jacket and spoke calmly into a radio as it soared into the unknown. But perhaps the most fascinating part of her legacy is that, nearly 90 years later, the world is still looking for her. Every few years, a new headline emerges, new bones analyzed. Satellite images show possible wreckage. Search team discovers fragment on remote reef. And each time, for a moment, the world holds its breath. Organizations like the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIRE, have mounted dozens of expeditions to Niku Maroro, scouring the island inch by inch. Their researchers have combed through colonial archives, analyzed old radio logs, and compared coral formations with early photographs. Some of the findings are compelling, like the partial skeleton discovered in 1940 by British colonial officials on the island. The bones were initially dismissed as male, but decades later, forensic reanalysis suggested they could very well have belonged to a European woman of Amelia's height and build. The bones, frustratingly, have since been lost. Then there are the fragments, pieces of aluminum found near the old campsite, one of which matches a repair panel installed on the Electra before her final flight. There are remnants of what might have been a woman's compact mirror, and the remains of small fires, animal bones, and fish that were butchered in ways typical of Westerners, not Pacific Islanders. Even the radio signals reported by amateur operators days after Amelia vanished, once dismissed as hoaxes, have been reanalyzed with fresh ears. Some now believe they were real transmissions, made by a stranded Amelia trying desperately to reach help before the tide or the elements silenced her radio forever. It's like assembling a puzzle with 80% of the pieces missing, but the picture forming is hauntingly familiar. Of course, not everyone agrees. Skeptics argue that much of the evidence is circumstantial, or based on assumption. They point out that Nikumaroro was visited multiple times after 1937, and no one ever conclusively reported seeing plane wreckage. And until something definitive is found, a serial number, a full skeleton, a journal in her handwriting, the mystery remains just that. But maybe that's part of the reason the story endures. Because mystery invites participation. It draws people in, turns researchers into detectives, and history buffs into adventurers. It lets each of us believe, even if only for a moment, that we could be the one to solve it. That we might one day be the answer to the question that's haunted the world for nearly a century. And yet, maybe the answer isn't the most important thing. Maybe what matters most is what Amelia Earhart represented, and still represents. She was born in 1897, before women could vote. She grew up in a time where girls were expected to wear dresses and keep quiet. But from the beginning, she challenged all of that. She climbed trees. She played basketball. She took her first flying lesson at 23 and never looked back. By the time she disappeared at 39, she had become a global icon, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, the first to fly solo from Hawaii to California, and the first to push for equality not just in the skies, but in society. She championed women's rights. She gave speeches. She wrote books. She founded organizations to help other female pilots, the 99s, still active today. She did it all with a quiet confidence, a calm resolve, and a look in her eye that seemed to say, "I'll go first, so you know you can too." That's why the world hasn't stopped telling her story. Because she showed what was possible when you refused to be confined by other people's expectations. When you looked at the horizon and said, "Why not me?" The plane may never be found. The records may never be clear. But Amelia Earhart's real legacy isn't lost in the ocean. It's soaring in every person who dares to chase something bigger than themselves. It's the girl who signs up for flight school. The boy who stays up all night reading about space. The student who speaks up in class when no one else will. The dreamer who keeps going, even when no one believes they can. That's the real story of Amelia Earhart. And it's not over yet.